You don't need the stones. You don't need the herbs. You don't need that $200 cast iron cauldron. You don't need the robes. You don't need anything. But what you do need is your desire to get things done. And once you have that, everything else is possible.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Ath, and today we are so excited to talk about servitors, sigils, and thought forms with the magician Mademoiselle Vendredi. And listeners, some of you might be asking, what is a servitor? How do you create one? What is a thought form? And what does it really mean to be practical with magic? Well, Mademoiselle Vendredi is a chaos-informed magician and crafter of servitor and thought form workshops. She's also a practitioner of sigils, glamour magic, and the evocation of spirits in very specific ways to achieve very specific results. Practicing magic for more than 30 years, magic continues to fascinate Mademoiselle Vendredi. Her search for the perfect formula, the precise words of power, has led her to delve deep into many forms of magic, from chaos to goetic evocation, hoodoo and the Shemham Farash angels, and the Enochian. And even though magic can be a true wonder to behold and the magical theory dazzling, she has always firmly believed in practical application in the real world. I also want to thank the wonderful Kate Crane, who first shared with me about Mademoiselle Vendredi and introduced me to her magical approaches. So thank you so much, Kate. And also a huge thanks to each and every patron supporter of Glitch Bottle on patreon.com/glitchbottle. Thank you for supporting the show and for your excellent questions for each of our guests. And now, to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Mademoiselle Vendredi. Mademoiselle Vendredi, thank you so much for coming on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited and I just have so much to say. So let's do this.
You mentioned, Mademoiselle, that you were always a very peculiar child. What is the earliest memory that you have of being attracted to or exploring esotericism or the occult? What was one of the first memories that you had?
Okay, so this is a great question because I love a good origin story. And if I had to very selfishly imagine myself as a superhero, this would be my origin story. So when I was very, very young, my mother used to love taking my sister and I to the local library. Books I came from a very good childhood. I don't have any qualms with that. It was not because I read so much because I was trying to escape, but the escapism itself allowed me to dream and think and create worlds in my mind, which just is titillating the right word? I guess it is, because that's how I felt every time I read. So I remember one day, I was probably 9, 10, definitely pre-high school. I hadn't entered high school yet. And I went into the library as usual on a weekend with my mother. And there was a part of the library that I guess it was this really old kind of weird porter cabin style library. And that sounds unusual in itself. And it wasn't an actual physical building. It was like a porter cabin. And at the back of the library, there was this section, and I'm sure your listeners will be familiar with the, I guess you'd call it the New Age section of a library. And we're talking about 30 odd years ago. So most of the titles didn't interest me at all. And obviously I was a child, so it just went straight over my head. But one title in particular actually caught my eye. It was a European folklore, superstitions and customs book. And believe me, I've been looking for this book ever since then. It was a thick tome, but it was sort of like a paperback. And it was very clearly a secondhand book. Someone had clearly just dropped it into the library. I don't know who the publisher was, but I remember from the moment I opened the book, there was like this crow on the front of it. And I remember getting really excited about this book. I was thinking, what is this book going to show me? And pretty much from there, that's where I started my unhealthy obsession in the occult and anything magical, because it allowed me for the first time to dream of possibilities, which most of us, when we're still kids, we think are possible until the moment we wake up and we think, well, that's not real. It can't be real. But for me, I never had that moment. For me, it was all like a magical realism film where the magic bled into the real life. So that's my origin story. It was this tome of a book, dusty, horrible cover, had a crow on it, and it was something like European customs and superstitions. And that's where it started. Yeah.
Was it like a sudden shift as soon as you read the book, or was it more like, oh my gosh, here's this book informing me about all of this, and all of a sudden you're looking around, noticing all of these other connections happening around you, or esoteric patterns, or what was going on when you were first delving into esotericism?
So to answer your question, I actually have to tell you another little story, which I guess you could call my second origin story. So my mother is a very well-traveled woman. And back in the 60s, she lived for a while in New York. So she actually went over to New York from the British Isles, hence why I have this type of accent, by the way. And she got involved with, she loved music. She still loves music, and she loves particularly Cuban music. So I remember her telling me, and it was a very, very early memory of mine. She would tell me about El Egua, the god of the crossroads, because she had encountered it herself through being involved with Cuban musicians at the time in New York, in Manhattan. And she would tell me all these stories about, if you listen to some songs, you will hear the names of the Afrocentric gods, specifically the Yoruba gods being called. And that really sort of planted a seed very early in my mind. And then other things happened. She told me about her time in Greece, where she lived for a long time. And she would tell me about the matiasma, which is the evil eye. And she would tell me about putting oil into water. And all these stories which she garnered and fed to my sister and I over the years as we were growing up, it just kind of went over my sister's head. But for me, it really planted a seed of possibility. And it's a feeling of excitement that I've never lost in all the 30 years I've been working with different methods. I've never lost that spark, that excitement for it.
I think this leads Mademoiselle Vendredi to that question about growing up and where you grow up. And we have a listener question for you from Jibril Mu'anna, who is asking and saying, quote, "I love how previous guests on Glitch Bottle have spoken about the power of jinn. My question for Mademoiselle Vendredi is, can you share about growing up in the Middle East and any Arabic esoteric influences or exposure? Thank you."
So this is going to be a complicated answer, but I'll keep it as simple as possible, because actually when I do think about it, it is simple. I have a complicated relationship with where I grew up. As most people who have been following me since before I closed down my Instagram at the end of last year, people who followed me right at the very beginning, I started speaking about my upbringing slowly, because even now I find it's difficult to explain, especially to people who want to know. But it's one of those cases where unless you were growing up in that environment, it is extremely difficult to communicate it. And for various other reasons as well. But I'll try and keep it simple. I would say that, especially in my early days, and we're talking again, so this was, I would say, at the very tail end of the 80s. So sort of, we hadn't reached the 90s witch aesthetic yet. It wasn't the craft or practical magic yet. So it was pre that time. I would say a lot of my earliest experiments were very much influenced by practices I'd seen here, such as, for example, the practice of writing specific numerical patterns into shapes and wrapping them up in paper and then blowing over them and saying a taweez, which is a prayer in the Islamic tradition, and then wearing it. I remember also one time I was on the beach, this was again years ago, and I remember I was swimming with some friends, and I actually remember finding something in the water, and it was, again, this sort of tightly bound up piece of paper that had, and I remember opening it with my friends. And of course, I remember thinking, I think I know what this is, but also not really knowing because I was very young and I hadn't involved myself that much yet into that particular method. But seeing people writing scrolls and numbers and patterns onto pieces of paper, seeing people putting those pieces of paper into door frames or into the soles of their shoes. I remember somebody doing that, a family friend. I would say I was greatly influenced by it. And then I took a sharp deviation from it, sort of beginning at the 90s, sort of early, mid 90s, because obviously by then it was all about Wicca was obviously on the scene then. That was a big thing. And, let's not kid ourselves. We were all swept up into the Wicca, whatever you want to call it, trend, as did I. But I would say that it's continued to very much influence everything that I do.
When you're doing that, you mentioned and you've shared previously that a big transition point for you was high school, and that in your formative teen years, there was a transition point for your magic. Can you share with the listeners who might not be too familiar, what happened here and how did seduction magic and sigils play a prominent role in your high school experience?
Oh, goodness. You've opened up a can of worms here. So, I'm sure your listeners will be pretty familiar. The awkward stage in high school when you first come in, and high school is a weird sort of purgatory for a lot of us. We're still figuring ourselves out. We don't know who we are. We change our minds so quickly that we're not sure if we're really one person or another person. I think the one constant for me was what I was trying to figure out on a more esoteric level. What happened in high school? Hormones and boys. And that's it. There's no mysterious story to it. I obviously entered high school, and I'd say by, I guess in America, you call it sophomore year, I was a raging hormonal teenager. And I, at that moment, I knew who I was. I knew more than perhaps my friends because, we were all sort of trying to figure out what we liked, what we didn't like, who we were. And for me, in my head, I saw one version of myself, and that's who I tried to be. And that's when I started experimenting with glamour and the aspects of altering how people react to you. And that's where I sort of began to focus my attention and my energy. And so all through high school, it was all about making myself look more attractive, making myself look popular or be popular. All the things that, if we're all very honest, we all wanted to be in high school. Maybe not all of us, but I did. I'm honest enough to admit I was never the popular girl, but I was the popular girl wannabe. So that's where a lot of my focus was on.
When you read the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, for example, it's ruthlessly practical in so many ways. And so high school, in many ways, also demands that ruthless practicality in specific ways, whether it's attracting someone or, heck, doing better on a test, or, you could think of a menagerie of things. Would that be somewhat fair that high school was a very practical environment?
I would say that's why I got into it, and that's remained a constant theme for me. Again, just to harken back to, for your listeners that remember that period in the 90s and mid-90s when it was all about, threefold law and you hummed that nun and all that. And I don't wish to actually criticize anybody that does follow that path. You do you. But I never vibed with that. I never thought that represented me and what I did and what I wanted. Like, for example, I wasn't interested in attuning myself to a higher level. No, I just wanted boys to look at me. It was very simple. And those types of methods I have always been attracted to. Yeah. So high school, you could say, was where it really developed into what I'm known for now, which is the practical aspects of getting things done. Yeah.
To drill down a little bit, Mademoiselle Vendredi, into the specifics, let's talk about sigils too, because many listeners are familiar, of course, with the sigils of the 72 spirits of the Lemegeton's Goetia, or the angelic seals of the Heptameron, or I'm even thinking of the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, where you have the 72 seals of the Shemham Farash in the 1600s, 1700s. But sigils have been described in so many ways. They're signatures of spirits. They're used to facilitate better communication or used in binding. There are so many definitions out there, but what is a sigil to you? How do you use a sigil of a spirit? What is that all about?
I actually gave this one a lot of thought, and I think even now I could give you several interpretations, and tomorrow none of them will make sense to me. But to give you a solid answer now, I would say that for me, sigils are nothing more than a driving mechanism to get to the result. So whilst I do believe that certain sigils have enormous impact on how we're able to achieve certain things, and its baseline, it's like the sigil is the car that takes you to the desire. And once you finish with the sigil, it then goes back to being nothing more than a couple of squiggly lines. And maybe that won't resonate for everybody, but I think that sigils, for the purpose that they serve, can really be driving motivators. It's like catalysts. They sort of explode onto the scene and get you to where you want to go, like a firecracker up your, you know what I mean? It sort of launches you to where you want to get to. When you get in your car and it takes you to where you want to go, once you get there, you don't give the car a second thought. You don't thank it. You don't pray to it. You don't give it offerings. And that is just how I work. So once I'm done with the sigil, it's done. And unless, of course, I'm working with a hierarchy of either the Shem HaFarash or the Goisha, that is different. But again, with my particular methods, how I've managed to sort of figure it out, let's say I want to evoke a particular spirit. I'll draw it down on my pad. It's not even a fancy pad. It's just literally one of those notebooks that you buy for kids in middle school. That's how basic I am. I'll just get it down onto paper. I'll go into whatever altered state I need to, drug-free, of course, for me. And to put it in the modern parlance, which people generally accept as being sort of like almost like law, you fire it off into the chaotic abyss and then you forget about it. And that sums the whole thing, the whole process up. Take the sigil, get into that altered state, send out your message, and then that's it. It just goes back to a piece of paper again. And sigils, there's so much we could say here. You know, we could argue that they bypass our ego and they enter into our subconscious. And I've never really liked that idea. So it's basically because I can never forget them. But if you do it in a particular way where you're forced to basically forget why you even made them, there are so many techniques. For me, the easiest thing to do is to just crumple up the piece of paper, throw it in the trash. I don't even burn it. I'll just throw it in the trash because for me, the act of throwing it in the trash or down the toilet, which is what I used to sometimes do, is in itself the act of releasing it. You're saying, right, that's done. The paper is not important. The sigil itself was just the vehicle for getting me to what I wanted.
I really like that metaphor and the way that you approach that because, you know, what I've seen online, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is there does tend to be in some areas almost a fetishizing of sigils, where sigils are turned into jewelry and tattoos. And again, people can do, of course, what they like, but there's a difference, as you say, between the kind of well-known sigils of specific hierarchical, chthonic, or sublunar entities versus what you're talking about, which it sounds like this is a very specific sigil for a very, very specific use that you create. And then after that is done, after the execution of the magical operation is finished, you release that. So it's almost like a license to depart in a way.
Yeah, that's actually the perfect way to put it. I would say you've given yourself and whatever you've put into motion the permission to go off and do what it needs to do. And after that, you just got to let it go. And I will actually make a point here and say, Alex, is that what you said about how we're seeing a fetishization of sigils. And, you know, I mean, Instagram is Instagram. It's, you know, we're going to see what we're going to see. But I do feel that perhaps my fear is that people will only see what they see on Instagram and think that is the only way to do it. And, you know, pre-Instagram, pre-TikTok days, I'm sure you remember them, Alex. It was the same thing. If you read something in a book and it said, you got to do it this way and this way and this way, and that's it, that's pretty much all you thought you could do with the material. Now we're seeing more authors and people on Instagram talking about their own methods. And I love that. And maybe that's why people like how I speak about them, because I do my own thing as well. I don't follow a specific pattern. Sometimes, for example, I will put the sigil in my wallet, but most of the time I'll just chuck it away and I'll completely forget about it.
I think to that point, Mademoiselle, when it comes to sigils, as you mentioned, you just get it down on paper. You just make sure that it's effectively that vehicle. How do you craft a sigil? So when you do get something on paper, is it working with a specific entity? Is it working with patterns and getting something on paper that way? Or how do you initially craft the actual shape of the sigil?
Okay, so now we're moving into sort of the actual praxis, how I do it. And again, I could tell you one thing today, Alex, and then next week I will have completely changed the method just because something else will feel better. So the way I go about doing it for me is I'll wait until I get the inspiration, and then I'll dig out my pad, paper, pencil, whatever, and just get whatever is in my head. I guess you could call it a little bit like automatic writing. I just get the image down, and it's not see, this is what I'm trying to say. For me, it's not about the sigil. It's about where I am mentally when I'm drawing the sigil onto the paper. I mean, it sounds completely loopy, but when I'm in that state, and I'm sure your listeners know that moment when you're right in the work and it's all clicking and you know what it is you want, and you're really feeling your own personal power in the work, I don't see the sigil at all. It's almost like once I come out of ritual, it's like, oh, that's what I drew, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? So I guess my answer to your question is I go in with very little structure, but I always end up with something quite elaborate at the end.
That's fascinating. Yeah, you allow yourself that breathing room, that you're not being constrained in any way with artificial boundaries or a specific petrified ritualistic structure that could eventually get in the way a lot more than it could help. Would that be somewhat fair?
I think you say it right. And I think the fairest thing, the way I could say it is that, of course, we all started somewhere. And like you said, for some people, it was one tome, one book, one method that they'd been taught. And like myself, I started off in a very structured way with sigils because I thought, it has to look like this, or I'd seen something in a grimoire and I thought, that's how I want mine to look, and it must always look like this, otherwise it won't work. But the most freeing thing in this type of work, and it goes beyond the method, the most freeing thing that I've learned, it's taken me 30 years to learn it, whatever you think is right. So if you think that one extremely complicated looking goetic sigil with Hebrew script and Shem angels around it is your thing, and that feels right, great. For others, it's going to be like a stick figure and it's got a crown on its head, and that's the sigil. That's it. And I'm getting excited now because that is truly the one lesson I could tell your listeners, if I may be so bold. Once you accept that pretty much anything goes, like the song says, it's so freeing. And actually, it leads into questions which I think your listeners have asked about being secretive and keeping things under wraps, as it were. I don't know if you want to go there yet, but I thought I'd just mention that.
No matter what structure or non-structure you're working with, just what resonates with you, what works with you. I love that. That's excellent. And yeah, I think, Mademoiselle, to your point, we've discussed this on the show in the past, but there have been guests who have spoken about this. There have been listeners who are asking about this. But one of the big questions is, my goodness, I'm so interested in the grimoires or in the PGM or in sigils or in tarot, divination, but I can't practice openly. I live in a country where it's a capital offense, or I live in a country where you could be jailed, or I live in a place where simply the cultural, societal expectations, if they found out, would just be egregiously detrimental to my day-to-day existence. So yes, can you share with us, Mademoiselle Vendredi, about what are some of the biggest tips, lessons, things that you love people to keep in mind if they are in an environment like that?
So this strikes a chord with me because growing up, that's pretty much the first thing I learned for myself. It was one of those lessons that I remember talking about this stuff, oh, what if magic really were real kind of thing. These types of silly questions you have when you're playing hide and seek, all that stuff. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could really turn invisible? Those types of conversations. Growing up in the environment that I did, those types of questions could lead to more attention than you would want. And I learned that very early. So my biggest rule, and I maintain it vigorously, especially on Instagram, is you don't reveal more than you really need to about what you do. There's this vogue to be out and open. And of course, we have Instagram, which has allowed us to, and obviously platforms like Glitch Bottle that have allowed those of us who truly are. I mean, we're in the box, in the box, in the box, in the back of the wardrobe, which is in the back of another wardrobe, which is in a tiny room, which is in a giant room, which is under a pyramid, that sort of type of hiding. My advice, the first piece of advice is very simple. Just keep your mouth shut. Nobody needs to know your business. Even if you do live in a country or in a region of the world where it's acceptable, to perhaps bring it up occasionally. Why would you want people knowing your business if they are quote unquote muggles? So being from the muggle world, it's just not a thing to start talking about ritualistic evocation of the 72 demons at the dinner table. Why would you do that? Concealment alongside seduction and glamour has always been at the forefront of my work. The biggest thing that I've learned over the years is that you don't, and this, I'm sure I'm going to probably get a bit of flack for this, and that's okay. My own UPG tells me that we don't need the stones. I'm cringing internally even saying this because I know at one point I did have the whole cabinet full of stuff in it, but you don't need the stones. You don't need the herbs. You don't need that $200 cast iron cauldron. You don't need the robes. You don't need anything. But what you do need is your desire to get things done. And once you have that, everything else is possible. I feel like a motivational speaker right now.
No, this is great. And I really appreciate that. And I really hope the listeners do too, Mademoiselle, because it's easy to, one of the classic terms that's used is just be an armchair magician. In other words, you sit there and you overanalyze a text, or which I love, nerding out about the latest, translation of a text. It's amazing. But when it comes to translating that to practical application, you can become so, at least I remember years ago when I started as well, thinking, okay, everything has to be perfect. It has to be 100% exactly as it says. And if I'm 25% through a ritual and I mispronounce a word in ecclesiastical Latin, then it's over. And that was not the case at all. And so it really sounds like you're saying that desire, and would it be safe to say desire and the relationship that you have with these entities, the relationships that you build with these entities is very, very important.
That again opens up another Pandora's box, because I spent a long time in my formative years and sort of latter years, I suppose you could call it, doing exactly that, building relationships with deities or with other such entities, altars, shrines. I've done the full shebang. At one point, like I'm sure a lot of your listeners, one entire wall of my apartment was basically just shrines and candles and all sorts of paraphernalia. We've all done that. And nothing wrong with it. I don't want anyone to sort of, accuse me of saying that that's a bad thing. It isn't. But again, through my own experiments, perhaps when we're dealing with entities, it's more about the respect that is given rather than the devotion that you give them. And perhaps that's going to ruffle some feathers, but to give a very clear example, again, I do work with 72 Goetia demons, and I won't sit here and say that I have an intimate friendship with any of them, even the ones that I work with regularly. For your listeners who follow my page, they will see that I will often mention particular entities, especially within the 72, when they've done something for me, But do I set up altars? Do I give offerings? No, I don't. Because at the end of the day, we've only got so many hours in the day, and I am engaging with these entities with the express purpose of getting what I want out of it. That isn't to say that I'm trying to subjugate or in any way demeanor them, but it is coming from a position of where I am the one in power that commands you to the place where I summon you. And that in itself is an enormous source of power. But relationships, as far as they go, I don't think they're necessary.
I think, Mademoiselle, this is a perfect time to discuss the concept, and maybe we can define this in terms of the servitor. What is a servitor? Because I know many listeners are familiar with, as you've intimated as well, conjuring a well-known or maybe not so well-known spirit that's listed in a grimoire. But what is a servitor, and how do they relate to some of those names that we find in grimoires from 500 years ago?
Such a good question. I guess the best thing for me to do is to just answer what a servitor is. Now, again, this is all personal gnosis. It's all my own UPG. I don't want to sort of go on record and say this is what they are definitively. I am as much an expert as the next person is a novice, and vice versa. The key to understanding what they are is, in my opinion, is in the name. They serve your wishes, and that is it. I mean, if you want to put it in really basic lingo, think of them as your own personal genie, or think of them as your own loyal army of servants. And I know that doesn't sound very politically correct, but we're not talking about political correctness. We're talking about entities that we create out of our own imagination, that we then task to do things for us. And because we create them, we are the center of their universe. It's what I teach in my workshops. When people have signed up to my workshops, I hope they got a lot more out of it than what perhaps they had thought they would get out of it, because I know that my way of approaching them sounds politically incorrect, but we're not dealing with people here. We're dealing with entities that we have created ourselves and fashioned out of our own imagination, our own desires, hopes, dreams, fears, belief systems. And all of that culminated together is a servitor. And what you do with them after that is your business.
You mentioned earlier the element of desire. So let's see if we can break this down a little bit. So let's say that you're ready to apply for a new job, and you really want, to appear in the job interview where everyone kind of finds you attractive, magnanimous, they're interested. And then my goodness, we have to have this person for the job. They'd be a great addition to our team. So do you take that desire? How do you galvanize that? Do you use a ritualistic structure to effectively increase the amount of gravity of desire that kind of pulls in specific sigilistic accentuations? Or how do you do this? How do you work with desire as a substance?
Okay, well, to answer this question, think about like for example, this case, the case where you have an interview coming up. You've already, let's say for the purposes of this example, you've already been invited for the interview, right? Now, what you want to make sure is that the right people, look at you, and not only look at you, but see, when they look at you, everything that you want them to see. My own personal experience has taught me through many, many experiments and many successes and some failures, of course, that servitors are brilliant at altering how people perceive us. And yes, for those of your listeners that are familiar, obviously, with the craft and all that 90s aesthetic glamour magic stuff, within the 90s sort of box, the whole eye change color, hair change color, things like that. I will go on record right now and say it could be possible, but remember, you're not changing. In this example, you're not changing physical and genetic structure. What you are doing is making people believe that what they see is real. It's like putting a stencil over a drawing. The stencil is the glamour. And this is what servitors can do. So I've sort of gone a long way around it. So I should go back to your question. Yes, I do have a specific ritual, which I do, but I have tried many methods. And believe me, there isn't actually a lot of material on this subject. Of course, I could quote Phil Hines' Condensed Chaos. That's the first book I always talk about when people ask me. Now, his chapter on Servitors is a good source of inspiration, but I would say if you're looking for very practical methods, you just got to go out and try it yourself. Sit down, think of what you want, and then create the image of something, an entity, which will fulfill that role. That's it.
To that point, Mademoiselle, we have a listener question for you from Sasha Olivier Dulac, who is asking and saying, "Hello, Alex, and hello, Mademoiselle Vendredi. Thanks for taking the time to go over such a great topic. I'd like to know," Sasha Olivier says, "aside from the basic servitor creation process, what other components do you include in your servitor's design? Planetary or elemental nature, psalms, characteristics from myth or legends, for example?"
Such a good question. Okay, again, to harken back to what I said at the beginning, anything that feels right to you is going to work because your desire fuels your imagination, and your imagination creates a character, whether that's inspired by the angelic or the demonic, or if it looks like something totally mythical, fantastical. I mean, don't even get me started on thought forms and egregores of popular monsters and spirits, which you could also use. With servitors, I think it's all about what feels right. Think about it like this. For those of your listeners who are designers by craft or just by hobby, it's like when you start off with a basic stick figure and then you sort of add a little element here and then you give it some hair and then you don't like the hair, so you erase it and put something else. And then you think, well, this thing should really have 3 heads because that's how I imagine it doing its task. And that's how you really build it. And yes, the creative process can be draining because essentially what you're doing is you're, by the very act of adding and subtracting and editing the servitor in your mind, you're pushing it into some sort of reality. It's like if I told you right now, Alex, oh, there's a famous legend in these parts of the woods, a 4-legged, backwards-facing goblin with sharp teeth and a big purple eye. Your mind's already creating it. Now, if I continue to give it a story, give it some powers, that can become my servitor. So to answer your listener's question, I have been inspired by other things before, such as myths, legends. I've been inspired by maybe a drawing I've seen and then created it into my own thing. And sometimes it's just been that I've woken up, I've had a desire, and I just needed something quick, and something popped into my mind. It can be as drawn out or as quick as you like.
Now, that's fascinating. And to that point, Mademoiselle, Sasha Olivier Dulac has a follow-up question for you, which is, what does your actual servitor creation or birthing ritual look like? Have you ever used formal conjurations to bring it into existence? And if so, what were the results?
Again, speaking purely from experience, I have tried to create servitors in the fashion of an ancient grimoire spirit, both in the way they act and the way they sound and the way they're summoned. So I've done that. But there are others which they simply pop into my head one day. I give them a name. I tell them who I am. I tell them what I want. And then they go off and do the thing. Without obviously meaning any disrespect on any of your listeners, when we get too bogged down with the details, it's like your parable about the armchair magician. If we spend so long trying to get it right and we don't allow our imagination to just flow, that's when we don't do anything, and that's when you don't get results. Yes, I've had results from spirits that are summoned with a very complex sigil and incense burning and very complicated words, which I've amalgamated together from other sources to create my own. And some of them, I've simply needed something very quickly, and I've sort of sat and thought about what they look like, and then just with my own act of thinking of them into existence, they become reality.
And you mentioned earlier, Mademoiselle, about this concept of hierarchy. So, when it comes to something like the 72 spirits in the Lemegeton's Goetia, do you consider the 72 to be simply 72 servitors that just kind of hung around and got preserved in a book? Or are there actual hierarchical structures that you employ in some kind of way over, quote unquote, your own personal servitors?
I'm going to start answering this question by saying something which is kind of irrelevant, but I think it works in the context of the answer. The beauty about the modern age and this golden age of occultism that we live in now is that with the greatest of respect to every single culture we might borrow from, we are free to explore whatever we want to explore, whether that be the 72 from the Lemegeton or Enochian or Servitors. When I'm operating with the 72 from the Goetia, I approach them as if they are real sentient forces. So I don't see them as servitors. But I also can imagine them being some type of servitor. Perhaps they were servitors to begin with. At the end of the day, again, to sound like a broken record, I don't really care as long as I get what I'm looking for. And perhaps that will sound contentious to some of your listeners, but truly, when I say I'm looking for results-oriented magic, that's it. With the greatest of respect to each of these entities and the systems they come from, at the end of the day, I'm doing it because I need to affect the reality that I'm currently living and transform it into one of my own liking.
Can you, quote unquote, combine a servitor? So you have a very specific servitor that you've birthed or created, quote unquote, and then you also have, say, an analog in the 72. Do you use some kind of conjuration or ritual, or simply just a force of the imagination to meld those two together and send out for a specific purpose? Or just how does that work?
I would say that it has to feel organic. And for me, it always felt organic to approach, say, one of the 72, but then also have a servitor working on the same case. And if you're really clever, you could even create a servitor in the fashion of a particular, well, I wouldn't say in exactly the same way as one of the 72, but give it your own servitor some of the qualities that you like. And then, because, I mean, this goes into perhaps another deeper topic, but do they all, whatever methods you employ, whatever hierarchies you use, do they all work together? Or do they all work on your target as if there is nothing else in the universe except for them and your desire? I like to believe, and my own experience teaches me, that my servitors know only what they see through me. That is to say, they may be aware, but they are unconcerned, perhaps. Maybe that's, and even that doesn't really explain it fully. None of this really matters as long as you get what it is you desire out of them. For my own personal thoughts, I would say that they all work apart from each other as if they are not aware of each other. But that's just my own personal gnosis. I don't know if anyone else feels the same way. Put it like this. If you want to get that job, perhaps you could task the Enochian, or you could go through the 72 Lemegeton, and you could also put one of your own personal servitors on the job, perhaps looking at it tackling it from a different angle, and you'll still get your result.
And we also, Mademoiselle, have a listener question for you from Kate Crane, who Kate's wonderful and first clued me in to your amazing work. And Kate is asking, when it comes to naming a servitor, I know you advise against calling your servitor, for instance, Juan or Harold, or the kind of name you'd give a human. Sometimes I get stuck on names. Do you, Kate is asking, Mademoiselle, have best practices for naming a servitor?
Best practices, no. But what I will say is that I definitely do tend to start with an image of the servitor before the name comes to me. Let's take another example. Let's say that you want to go on an exciting voyage. So you create a servitor that looks like a pirate or looks like a sailor, just for example. Within the process of creating the image of them, for me, the name sort of comes, it's sort of part of that process. It's like with the sigil work, you're allowing it to mull over. And I won't go as far as to say is that every single time, as soon as I've created the image of the servitor, I've got a name. Very often what will happen is I'll be driving somewhere, or I'll be sitting on a plane or whatever, and then the name will just be like, oh, that sounds about right. And sometimes it is literally about just jiggling the vowels around. One thing which I have discovered is that if I'm doing a lot of Shem work, when I'm also creating a servitor, very often the name will sound I don't want to obviously offend anyone here, but for lack of a better word, they sound Hebrewish because that just happens to be the system I'm working with in that particular moment. So of course, the name I'm going to be influenced by that. And sometimes the name just sort of randomly pops into my head. I like it. It's simple or it's complicated. It matches the servitor's qualities, what I wanted to do. And then I just go with it. Again, to sound like a really broken record, if it sounds right to you, then it is.
You've talked about how there's not a lot of devotional aspects in your work. It's about acknowledging the servitors and showing respect, but there's not a lot of devotion there. And then I think this kind of ties into a question from Kate Crane again, who's asking and saying, in a workshop, you said that emotionally it has to be a two-way street. Could you elaborate on that? What does it mean for something to be a two-way street, especially if, say, as you mentioned with sigils, there's a vehicle, there's a use, and then there's a license to depart?
What I found is that when you really get into servitors, and I'm not just talking about one-off, I'm talking about when it becomes part of your main practice, as you continue to build relationships, and I will use the word relationship here because there's no other way to describe it. It's a mutual, functional relationship between you and the servitor. And of course, these are not static beings. They develop as you develop. When you gain more knowledge, they gain more knowledge. So I guess what I'm trying to say here, and to answer Kate Crane's question, is you can get to the point where they feel as familiar to you as your sibling or your partner. But I never cross over into friend territory with them. And again, that's just how I work. And for the people that do attend my workshop, I always advise to start there in a position of power where you are very clearly the center of this entity's universe. You are the sun to their world and no other exist. But you find that those types of relationships don't stay lineal. I mean, for example, just before we started speaking, I was actually having a chat, and I will use that term. I was having a bit of a chat with one of my servitors about something. And actually, I was telling them how well they had just recently done something for me. I think the answer here is that you really have to try it for yourself, because I might say that I will never have a buddy-buddy friendship with mine, but another person might go into it, and because of who they are and their experiences, they will come up with something totally different. There are no wrong answers in this type of work. If they feel like close friends, the bottom line is, Alex, as long as they actually do what they are tasked and created to do. When they stop doing that, then perhaps it's not a servitor anymore, it's something else.
That's such a lovely point. And it's something that's been discussed as well, where for some people, the high Middle Ages, Catholic ritual structure of, the Liber Iuratus or the Lucidarium is a wonderful system because it works for them and they're achieving the same or similar results because there's a resonance there, whether it's historical, cultural, something calls out. Just like on the opposite side of the spectrum, someone with no equipment, someone who might say, well, I don't have anything, but I'm using the specific raw power of the imagination, and I'm using very specific tools or other tools to achieve the result. As you said, Mademoiselle, if it works for you, if you are getting results, keep doing it. It sounds like.
It took me a while to get to that point. I'm not going to sit here and say that right off the bat, everything was working for me, that I never had to change anything about how I do things. I've managed to get them working consistently for me now, but it's taken me a lot of experimentation. I've gotten to the point where I'm confident enough that I can speak to people about this topic and tell them definitively that this is what I've done, this is how I did it, this has worked for me. Try it. Because I can tell you right now, I've got 1,000,001 stories on how I've managed to use servitors to get exactly what I wanted. And when I say exactly, it's not like, oh, well, I kind of got a version of what I wanted. No, in a lot of cases, servitors are so good at getting what you want that when you do it for the first time, it will. I mean, you could be a novice or an adept alike, but the first time you use this type of stuff, it can blow your mind.
So, Mademoiselle, this brings up the point of petitions. There's been a lot of opinion on the specificity of petitions, of some spirits. I'm thinking of mercurial spirits can maybe tend to be a little bit tricky at times. Specific spirits, even in the Lemegeton, it says they will specifically lie to you unless you specifically use their sigil and specific nomina magica. So when you have that desire built, that raw clay of desire, and now you have a sigil and an image of a servitor, when you actually request something, is it a verbal request? Is it something that is written out almost in the, classic 17th century English lawyer angel magic contracts where it's paragraph to paragraph? Or is it simply something where it's embedded in the sigil itself? How do you achieve that specificity in the request?
So, of course, there's a loose method to it. In so many words, you put the desire, the initial desire, into its creation process. So that could entail anything from writing it down that's all it is. You write it down and you vocalize it and then you speak the words. But after that, whatever conversation or interaction you have with them is very much sort of ad-libbed. At least that's how I do it. So again, to sort of hammer home this point, they work for you, but the interaction is mutual friendship. But also, you are definitely the leader. You are the conjurer. You are at the center of their complete universe. You are the be-all, the alpha and omega of their entire existence. When it comes to crafting them and setting them to work, sometimes it's as simple as just telling them, I want you to do this. Sometimes I'll say it aloud. Oftentimes I'll just say it in my head once I've called them. If it's convenient, I think perhaps more often than not, I will say it out loud under my breath, or if I'm sort of in the privacy of my own home, I will just speak. And anyone perhaps who is visiting my house at that time, who doesn't know what I'm involved in, will probably just think I'm a crazy. Maybe that's what the crazy people that we see are actually doing. They're speaking to their own servitors or thought forms. Who knows?
You might have uncovered a global pattern that maybe we haven't been as perceptive before on it. That could very well be. Mademoiselle, to that point, we have a listener question for you from Wilma, who is asking, hey, Mademoiselle Vendredi, I'm buzzing right now that you are coming on the podcast. And Wilma is saying, Mademoiselle, I've always come from a more traditional ceremonial magic background. So the term thought form is new to me. And so Wilma's asking, Mademoiselle, what is a thought form? And can they be incorporated into classical grimoire work? Thank you.
Totally valid question. What is a thought form? It literally, the key is in the name. It's a thought that has taken form. And that's obviously a very oversimplification of the whole thing. But the best analogy I can give you is, like, for example, when you're a child, when we're children, we play. That's how we develop. That's how we make friendships. That's how we learn to all our basic skills, interacting with others. It just so happens that also for a lot of us, or some of us, we interact with imaginary friends. It's not always the friend that you see every day at school. I don't know about you, Alex, but I had a couple of imaginary friends. And maybe that's why I took to this type of work so easily, at least for me, because I was, I had a bit of an active, as you can imagine, an overactive imagination, and sort of calling up these great and mighty monsters and entities in my mind was easy. But to answer the question which Wilma asked, thought forms in the classical sense, or at least in the parapsychological sense, are just thoughts that have been given some sort of form in the imagination. Now, the technique with thought forms is that they need repetition. Let's think of it in another way. Loch Ness Monster. We all know the mythology of the Loch Ness Monster. We all know Ogopogo. We all know these sea creatures that apparently live below in the waters. They may or may not be real. The point is there is a collective amount of people that as soon as you say Loch Ness, they're all thinking, okay, large, scaly, underwater, possibly cryptid, dinosauric type thing that's managed to evade us. That is a thought form. It's a collective understanding. And anything can be a thought form. Oh, Alex, you've opened up a whole box here. You could even go as far as to say that the famous brands are thought forms. McDonald's, for example. Let's take that one, for example. I love McDonald's. And when I think of McDonald's, I think of fast food, obviously, like all of us do. And I think of convenience, but I also think about it as an entity. McDonald's is a multi-billion-dollar successful company that spans pretty much every single country in the developed world and other countries. When you say the word McDonald's or you see the symbol, you're immediately thinking about the taste, about the burgers, but you're also thinking about the success of the chain, how it's managed to grow. It's like Starbucks. Starbucks is similar. When you think of Starbucks, you think of coffee, whether you like it or not, but you also think of a very successful chain that's managed to multiply and grow its business exponentially. When enough people think of one thing constantly in one particular way, you're giving that thought a type of form, whether you acknowledge it or not. That's it. That's what thought forms are. The second part of the question was, can they be incorporated into more classical techniques? Of course they can. You can even create your own thought form that acts like an ancient entity. And that is your own thought form that's also different from a servitor in that the way they're created and what they can do. But essentially, you make it into something through sheer force of thought.
Mademoiselle Vendredi, to your point and to Wilma's question, do thought forms, since you mentioned repetition is key, do thought forms after a specific amount of repetition become a servitor? Does that shape get translated into a formal, quote unquote, even though it's not as formal, servitor that is then sent out with specific instructions? Or how does that process work?
If you read a lot of the material online and also in a lot of the chaos magic books, especially from Phil Hine and anyone else who's written anything since then that's been based off of his material, the word egregore is bandied about a lot. So can they go off with enough attention and enough people thinking about them constantly? Can they go off and do their own thing? I'm not an egregore, so I couldn't say. But what I can say is that definitively speaking, we will never know. It's like with everything that we do. Unless you see an actual result, it's all speculation. But from my own point of view, in my own practice, thought forms with enough energy, time, with enough people focusing in on it, yes, I guess they can go off and do their own thing. Think about the egregore of the monster that lives under the bed. We've all had that nightmare of something that lives under our bed that scares us witless. Sometimes even me, even now, I sometimes think there might be something under my bed or in the wardrobe. That could be an egregore that's developed and been strengthened through people's collective fear, and it's become its own thing. So yes, I guess egregores can go off and do their own thing and be their own thing. Whether we can control them or not, I think it's completely up for speculation.
As well, Mademoiselle, you mentioned that experience, your experience, it's the greatest teacher. And to that point, we have a question from Octavian Graves, who is asking, do you, Mademoiselle, feel that servitors are purely creations of the subconscious, or can they be objectively external spirits using our subconscious as a more convenient way of manifesting?
My glib answer is, does it really matter? As long as they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, I guess for me, it doesn't matter. But if I were to speculate on this point, whether they are offshoots of our imagination that we then turn into a thought form type thing that grows off of our fears and desires and whatever, I treat them as their own separate entity. I imagine them as being very much sentient and apart from my own thinking. I don't think it needs to be any more complicated than that. The theory on thought forms and servitors is fascinating. And a lot has been said both in occult circles, but also in paranormal research and also in popular psychology. It's been discussed. Freud never used the term thought form from what I believe to be true, from what I've read. However, he's always suggested the idea that humans are capable of creating, as we know now, alter egos of our own self. And depending on which ego is present at that time, you end up manifesting a very different type of energy. Or basically, to paraphrase Freud, the mind is so infinitely limitless that when we get stuck and bogged down with the details of what is a thought form, what is a tulpa, what is an egregore, throw all of that out of the window and just do it. Right now, I encourage all your listeners to just literally, out of their own imagination, create something, then talk to it, feed it, tell it what you want, send it off on tasks. If you are more influenced by European style witchcraft, then imagine it to be your own personal familiar. If you are into some, I won't say all, but there are some indigenous practices of the Americas, both South and North, where this idea of a familiar spirit, or in the Islamic tradition of Qareens or Qareens and Qareenas, individuals' own personal spirits. Or if you really want to go into it, you could even say that your own holy guardian angel is just your own personal thought form. Throw all of that out the window and just do it, Create something, see it in your mind's eye, interact with it, tell it to do whatever you want it to do, and just sit back and see what happens.
And as well, Mademoiselle, we have another listener question for you from Kate Crane. And Kate is asking, you've also said, Mademoiselle, that creating a servitor involves the right combination of words and emotional state. Is this just about deep focus or also about picturing the servitor doing the work it's meant to, or something totally different? And just to follow Kate's question, Mademoiselle, as you mentioned earlier that, without using psychedelics or anything, you do enter into an altered state. So can you share about that, about deep focus, altered states? What does that all mean? How does that work?
I'll answer your last question first, and then I may have to actually ask you, Alex, to repeat the first one again with Kate's question. Deep focus. Deep focus for me is all about the build up to the moment. So it starts from the moment you decide to do something. Let's say, again, you need that job, you want more money. That's where the focus starts. And your mind sort of goes into hyper focus where you think, okay, this is what I want. This is what I need. How am I going to do it? What methods could I be employing now as a magician to get to that point where I've received what it is I want? That's one part of it. The other part is where you're actually sitting down, whatever ritual it is you do to get yourself into that moment, turning off the lights, doing it at midnight, doing it at a certain time of the year, moon phases, all of this you can use. But I think there has to be a shift in reality in your mind. For your listeners that do a lot of evocation, perhaps it would be right to say that there's that moment where you first call one of the 72 into your space. And there's almost a moment where, and this is my own experience, of course, I don't know if anybody else feels this, but there's almost like a moment where everything's dead quiet. There's almost like an energy, an electric something in the air. It's almost as if someone's sucked everything out of the room and replaced it with something else. That is the moment I speak of when I talk about deep focus. It doesn't matter if I'm working with a sigil or doing full evocation. But aside from that, after the whole creation of a servitor is done, I never enter into that space again mentally with the servitor. It's just a simple case of calling them with the words that I've created, giving them their task, and then just sending them off to do it. And then, of course, one of the crucial elements of this type of work is to feed them with your attention and your gratitude once they have completed the task.
To that point, Kate Crane was asking, because I completely commandeered her question, about the right combination of words and emotional state. And if that emotional state is deep focus or picturing the servitor doing the work.
Okay, so picturing, I don't picture. I just simply call them up, tell them what I want, and send them off. License to depart, whatever you want to call it. I do say in my workshops that a certain, at least at the beginning, there has to be that driving force the reason why you want to get this result. And that is what fuels the creation process of the servitor. The combinations of words, when I say they have to be the right combination of words, what I mean to say is, again, that they are the right combination of words for you. I tend to just create words on the spot. If I like the sound of them, I use them. And over time, as I use them, they gain their own type of power. But is this connected to deep focus? It is, when I'm in the creation process and the moment that I want to bring them into the world, as it were. But after that, I never do that again with each individual servitor, because they've been charged with the intention, your desire, your hopes, fears, dreams, and all of that. They know what to do. So I guess this is why I don't believe praying to the servitor is beneficial for the magician, because they know what it is you want. They are a part of you. They know that when you say, I really want to find love, they know maybe what you really mean to say is that you just want to have someone for the night, to put it politely. They know that. However you might go around it in your own way of describing it, they will do. But they're maybe, what we could say here is they're basing their actions off of your emotional state. It's like telling your friends, oh yeah, I'm super happy, when actually deep down you're very, very sad. And the servitor, I think, will hear the words that you say, but they will also feel out what you're really saying, what you're really feeling, and the emotion attached to those words.
As you mentioned, once you go through that formal process, formal quote unquote, about that initial emotional state, the imagination, the generation, and you send the servitor out and it's completed the task, you thank the servitor for completing the task. Do you go back to servitors? Do you go back to servitors that you've used in the past for another specific task? Or if you would like to get another job or would like to, go on a date or whatever it is, do you just have a completely different servitor creation process for that?
Great question. And it's one which is actually asked a lot. How many is too many? Maybe that's the question we're really asking here. It's entirely up to you. I have servitors that work all the time on one very specific thing, and they've been doing it for a number of years. And there are others which require very quick action. And so they'll be created in the moment, sometimes in the space of half an hour or an hour. I don't like to rush these types of things, but that is basically that's how they became popular. They were known for being sort of taking all the fluff out of all the complicated and complex and frankly unintelligible rituals which people up until that point had been using as a source guide, like, for example, that first translation of the Goetia, Crawley's version, right? Crawley's version was a mess, and we obviously now, with hindsight, have a lot of real scholars who've looked at it, and Goetia of Dr. Rudd will just show you just how wrong he got a lot of it. My point here is that that's how this type of method came about. We got rid of all the fluff, all the surplus, and just took it right down to the bare bones. And if you really think of it in that way, it's just creating an imaginative servant, ally, friend, and telling it what you want it to do. That's it. There's nothing more complicated than that.
So to that point, Mademoiselle, what role does astrology or planetary days and hours play? It doesn't matter if it works for you, use it, or is it during a waxing moon, there might be more of a pull from the lunar tide, so to speak, or how do you approach that?
I actually saw a meme a couple of weeks ago on Instagram, which really made me laugh. And it was something about the Mercury. It's always the Mercury retrograde. Why is it never? It's always the Mercury retrograde that we always see online, And the meme basically was, if you don't want to be affected by the Mercury retrograde this month, just stop believing in it. And that's it. So to answer your question, I wouldn't go as far as to say as I was into planetary hours and timings. That was too much work for me at the time. I just wanted the result. But I did used to take into consideration moon phases, times of the day, and days of the week. Now, it's just whenever I get the urge, or more importantly, when I have a need for it. Lest we forget that we're doing this type of work because we really need that job, because we have to support our partner, or we really want to find love. It's not just a whim. And maybe sometimes it is a whim. But the point is, it starts with you needing something right now. I was very lucky. At one point in my life, I wouldn't say I was being trained, but I was in contact with practitioners of Obia or Obea from the islands in Jamaica. I also had the good fortune of working with one or two hoodoo workers who had learned their craft from family members. At the time, it was kind of weird the way it all sort of came about, but perfect synchronicity. And we managed to learn from each other and so forth. And I remember they became very good friends of mine, saying to me, no one's got time for planetary hours and moon phases. I don't want to wait a whole month to get rid of my noisy neighbor. I need to do it now. And that has always remained with me. So it's beautiful when everything comes together, when all the planets are aligned, which I think is happening this month. I think I saw something recently about it. It's beautiful when that happens, but nothing in my experience trumps real, raw desire.
Thinking of that quote from William Blake, where when he was at the gates of death, he was very sick, and he mentioned that even if I die, he said something along the lines of, quote, but the real man, the imagination will never die, is eternal. And as we're having this discussion, I'm just getting the impression that really this is an homage. Your practice is a recognition, an accentuation, an homage to the untapped power of this pregnant field of potentiality of consciousness that we have, that we don't access or exercise enough. Does that be somewhat fair?
I think it's fair to say that all of us come to what we do through different lenses. 3 different magicians could look at Servitor work from 3 completely different cultural lenses, languages, even their own language, their traditions, cultures, even what they've been taught. It's probably not unfair to say that a lot of people who have come to this type of magic or any type of work, occult work, come from perhaps a Christian background. So there's always going to be a lot of hangovers, whether it's acknowledged or not. But truly, I'm not a guru. This has taken me so long to get to this point where I can even do it. The beauty of saying, okay, I'm going to pick up this mug, which I've got in my hand, and this mug is now the ship that's sailing out to sea that I don't want to sail because it's got someone on that boat that I want to keep with me. And just that act of transformation in my mind, maybe you won't affect the ship, but what's stopping you from trying? And that's how I think when we get better at accepting that sort of hyper-connected reality where this stick of lipstick is also the wand which wields enormous power through the act of waving it about in my hands. That's oversimplification. But the point is, my mind has already made the connection. It does not matter what I have around me. And if I might actually, Alex, there's another point I wanted to make about a question you said earlier, which is, how do we remain hidden and concealed in our practices from those we would not wish for them to know? Again, this took me a long time to get to this point when at the time I thought, you needed the perfect herb or you needed that particular rock that's been blessed by 3 nights on the full moon on a craggy rock in Scotland kind of thing. Sounds amazing, but all that build up can all work just as well in the head. This is another word which I never like to say the word because it sounds so 90s cringy, but if you really are in a situation where you cannot use anything, astral temples, they are amazing. I'm going to go on record and say this. For a long time, it's not the case anymore. My astral temple was the house from Practical Magic. And in my mind's eye, I would go into the house and I would stand wherever it was, probably in the kitchen. If anybody remembers that film, I'm betraying my age here now, but basically that was where I did all my work. Anything that now at the moment requires a candle could just as easily be done in an astral or on the astral, as it were. Again, just to sort of circle back to what we were saying, all of this basically means that from the moment your mind says, yes, this is the reality, I've accepted this mug as the ship that is going out to sea. It is not a mug, it's the ship. And in it is the storm that I brew, whatever. When you make that connection in your mind, possibilities are limitless.
As you've said earlier, Mademoiselle, one of the most important things is when you're creating these servitors and thought forms, you're the sun, quote unquote, and the servitors are kind of orbiting around you in a specific analogy. We do have a listener question for you from Anonymous, who is asking, I'd like to ask Mademoiselle Vendredi to discuss the ethics of using servitors to influence or break down the will of another person. Can you share a little bit about that? What role does personal ethics play?
I think the key word here to take away is personal. They are personal ethics. And whether your ethics subscribe to the sort of binary good versus evil dichotomy, or if you ascribe more to the whole, don't do me ill and I won't do you ill kind of thing, it's very personal. And it changes. This is something I also learned. You can be very set in one way of thinking, and that will influence everything that you do. But then you might find through experience that you actually think, no, this is not the reality. This is not how my ethics work. How much do ethics work in this very specific context, which your listener asked? It's like I've said actually quite a few times now with other people, students in my class. What you do behind closed doors, when no one's watching, is entirely up to you. And what you think might be an act of great love might to another person be a great act of wrath, and to another person, a great act of apathy. So my point, I guess, is you do whatever you need to do to get the result you want. And if that means that you have to create a servitor to willfully change someone's mind, perhaps you need the landlord to be a lot friendlier to you, to accept that you haven't paid 3 months of your rent, so they'll be nicer to you. You know what? Who's to judge? That's between you and the landlord. And again, the same analogy. Once I close the doors to my own personal space and no one's there, no one's watching me, I am my own God. And I know that's going to seriously ruffle some people, but that's how I think of it. And perhaps there are many things that I have done in the past which would make people perhaps not want to follow me on Instagram. But you know what? I'm pretty sure those people have done similar things that I would consider to be very morally or ethically gray.
So if you have a specific worldview or a specific set of priorities or realities, you have these priorities, and whatever you need to do to get there within your own personal idiosyncratic ethical framework is what you should do, basically. I don't know if I'm phrasing that right.
I think that's right. We all operate within our own little universes of thought and belief and moral overview of the world. And if that so happens to be that if you can justify it to yourself, I think the one thing I will say, and I have to add this is quite a strong one, whatever you hope to achieve through servitors or evocation or whatever, as long as you can own up to what you've done. I'm not saying, go out and proudly say, oh, yes, I did this and that and the other. But if you get the result you wanted, but it came through in a way that you didn't intend, you've still got to own that as something that you caused. So I guess what I'm trying to say is be careful what you ask for, That's not like because there's some presiding deity that's going to punish you. It's that you might end up, through no fault of your own, not liking the result, or maybe getting too much of a good result to the point where you're like, why did I even do this? If you can justify it to yourself, cool, I'm good. You're good. We're all good.
You mentioned earlier too about through your own experience, finding out what works and what doesn't work. And I think there might be listeners out there going, oh, I'm so excited. This is great. I really want to try this. But can you share with us maybe one or two things that you found out through your experience? Like, okay, there's a lot of stuff you can do with your imagination, with desire, with creating thought forms. But trust me, from my own experience, don't do X. Is there something that comes to mind that you maybe see some people do that you think, hey, you should really not do that?
That's such a difficult answer to give you, because the inner rebel in me is already kind of chafing at your question, because it's like, if you want to do it, if you want to get yourself in trouble or suffer with the consequences, go ahead and do it. That's my philosophy. You do your thing. I'll do mine. I'll deal with my fallout if and when it happens, or if it happens, I should say. But perhaps there are one or two things I could definitively say in everything that we do. I think we sometimes get perhaps so caught up in the excitement of being able to literally, once your mind is liberated from the thought that there are limitations, it can be so freeing. However, having said that, my own personal experience on this one, let's go back to the eye color changing glamour, or change your hair color, or make you taller, or make you shorter, or whatever it is. The best answer I can give here is you're never going to get a physical genetic change in your structure. If you want to get a smaller nose, pay a lot of money and find the best cosmetic surgeon you can to get it done. Don't waste your energy on trying to do it through Servitors. However, having said that, remember what I said before, Servitors, if done in the right way, can very expertly change how people see you. Maybe you do want to appear taller. It won't be that you go from looking like a midget to a giant, but people will perhaps, and this is, again, through all personal experience, I haven't ever tried to make myself taller, but I've definitely, on an active, ongoing basis, tried to influence how people perceive me. And actually, if you really want to get into the topic, isn't that what we're all doing through the clothes we wear, the makeup we wear, how we cut our hair, how we talk, how we walk? It's all influence. But Servitors go one step further. They can alter how people see you and feel about you. So my experience has always told me that I won't affect physical change on myself if that's what I want, but it will make people think to a certain degree that that's what's happened. Case in point, and I can actually talk about this. I have a magical partner, and my partner and I, we sort of do various experiments together. And one fairly recent experiment was based off of the idea of getting people to see a different shade of hair color. As you can see, and your audience can't see, I have quite a dark hair color. So trying to convince people that I have a lighter hair color sounds ridiculous. However, through a process of experiments with my magical partner, we were able to effect some sort of change to the point where people were like coming up, well, friends of mine who know me, were asking just offhandedly, have you been to the salon recently? You seem to have highlights or lowlights. And it wasn't like an extended conversation. But the point is, I achieved my goal. I was able to affect how they perceived subliminally through the ether. They were able to perceive a different color than the one that was in front of their eyes. Sounds total bizarro, I know. Even when I say it out loud, it sounds like total fantasy Mickey Mouse land. But give it a try, see how it works.
Oh, that's making me think of the illusory experiments found in the mid-1400s grimoire, the Munich Manual, recorded in Forbidden Rites by Dr. Richard Kickheffer, where there's a whole section on illusory experiments where you can evoke a palace in front of people. You can evoke a banquet with food. You can evoke armies that it appears as if there's an entire army or an entire feast there. And so that when you were sharing that, are those things really there? Or as you say, is it that whoever is perceiving that is being led to believe that what they are seeing is a different shade of hair color or a banquet or something like that?
Maybe it's not so much coincidence, but we've clearly been reading the same texts because, yes, I'm very familiar with that work as well. And yes, the idea of illusory experiments and that's basically how I started off on this journey. And then my magical partner and I, we just decided to combine forces and sort of work the theory and how would it work with a servitor? Would it be best as a thought form? And perhaps to go all the way back to your original question, my one big thing is you can't affect something that is fundamentally part of your DNA. Your genetic structure is your structure. And perhaps also I should say that we live within the constraints of our world, and that includes the physics of our world. So basically, I've never met anyone who can actually fly. The actual either hop on a broomstick or whatever. I've never seen that. I've never witnessed it. I know there are certain Eastern philosophical mysticism rites where there is this idea of levitation. Get it? I got it. But what you could do is create a thought form or servitor that gives the illusion that perhaps you have flown, and that people go, "Oh my God, did you just levitate?" Now it's really sounding crazy. But again, these are where my experiments have taken me. And that's really it. I don't like to cast aspersions on what I see on Instagram, for example, or what people write up in blog posts. To each their own. If you get a result from it, great. I'm not going to sit here and say, you can't do that. What's the word that's being bandied about a lot right now? Gatekeeping. I abhor that word because I think it's so presumptuous. So my basic philosophy is you do what you want to do. If you get results, great. If you don't, also great. Just leave me to do my own thing.
Something that, especially given your experience in helping students and having workshops and discussing servitors and thought forms, what are 2 or 3 big misconceptions that people always have about servitors or thought forms? And I guess then asked in the opposite, what are 2 or 3 things that you really would love people to just always keep in mind about servitors and thought forms?
The thing that I always get asked, or I get asked a lot, is, can they ever go rogue against you? You hear stories, you think of the classic Golem of Prague. I know that's not exactly a servitor or thought form, but the same principle, created in such a fashion to help the people, but ended up sort of going on a bit of a rampage. I've never had someone be able to 100% verify the supposed servitor getting out of hand, running off and doing whatever they wanted to do. If you birth them in such a way, there is very little, minuscule chance of that happening. In all of my years of working with servitors, and I think now I can confidently say about 7 years of devoting myself to this particular branch, I've never once had one go rogue. There are theories on why this may happen. Maybe you, as the magician, lose focus, or maybe you didn't create it correctly, or maybe it was your own fear of the servitor itself that made it sort of turn into something that didn't want to help you or achieve your own goals. That's the first misconception, I would say. There are really no others. Mainly what people tend to ask me is, can it do this? Can I do it with that? Can I make the sky rain frogs? Can I do all sorts of things? My answer is always going to be a blanket yes, but try it first before you ask me. There's no point in asking me if you can affect the weather before you've actually tried it. Try it first and then tell me what you got from it. If you didn't got what you wanted, then your answer is clear. But then maybe I might say, work it in a different way. Maybe work not against nature, but with it a little bit more, in this case. In terms of bearing things in mind, all this talk about servitors being able to do almost miraculous things, like changing hair color, changing eye color, all that stuff. We should always bear in mind that even though our minds are truly limitless, it doesn't mean that every single time you create a servitor that it will be as unlimited as your potential. It may be that when you come to ritual, to creating them, that you have certain hang-ups. Let's say the classical one, which is the classic love drawing. People who do love work who want to attract a partner. That's the surface desire. But the deeper desire might be that they're suffering from long-term trauma. So they might try and create a servitor to get a partner, but then they end up getting something very different, or they end up getting nothing at all. My point, I suppose I'm trying to say, is that it's easy enough to say that we are limitless in our capacity to do things and affect change, but we are not always going to feel that limitless when we come into creating them. When we come into that process of creating them, we're not always going to feel that way. And that will affect it, perhaps.
Using the imagination, it's once that begins to merge into this realm of physics and reality, it takes on a different cadence, a different cognition, a different kinetics than would otherwise be seen if it was purely just something you thought of while you were on the bus, traveling somewhere.
Exactly that. Yeah. I mean, I've spent pretty much the whole hour saying to you that from my own experience, it's all about being completely unshackled from anything that's weighing us down in terms of how we think about the process. Is it possible to do this or that? Yes, it is. But I'm also saying, on the other hand, that we will not every single time go into ritual and feel this way. And that will affect the process, the outcome.
You know, Mademoiselle, I know you've touched on this before, but can you please definitely share about any upcoming workshops that you have? You know, where can people find you on social media? How can people get in contact with you and check out the different services and workshops that you have going on?
Well, I actually have a very strained love-hate relationship with Instagram, and my followers from last year will remember that I decided to take a long break, as I feel we all should occasionally, not just in our normal muggle Instagrams, but also what we do. Well, obviously I can be found at Mademoiselle Vendredi, if you just search that name. There's nobody else on Instagram, I believe, that has that name. And I only have that page. And I try to update it fairly regularly. Also, I try to answer people's DMs. So in terms of workshops, I don't have a set calendar, but I do have 1 or 2 events coming up in July. In fact, one which I'm holding on July the 16th is specifically on glamour magic. It's not really going to cover the topic of servitors, but I will speak about them. But I will cover methods that I've found to be so useful in glamour. And I'm not only going to talk about the typical glamour, which is beautification and adornment and attractiveness, but I will also talk about concealment, which is, like I said at the beginning, another big part of my practice. So that's coming up soon. And if I'm very honest, I actually was debating on, in August, actually holding a few of the more popular workshops again. Definitely in August, I can tell you this, I will be doing a Beginner's 101 workshop again. It's my most popular one. It's called the Scintillating Servitor workshop, and it's a basic introduction. It's like a basic introduction / crash course on how to work your own servitors, creating them, starting from the very beginning and taking you all the way through the process that I do. And that will be in August. The date hasn't been announced yet, but yeah, if your followers want to know more, they could always follow me, or they could just stay tuned for updates. I will probably announce it at some point.
Definitely check out, listeners, the links below in the video and podcast descriptions to check out how to get in touch with Mademoiselle Vendredi. Anything else that you'd like to share with listeners today?
The one thing I would like to reiterate from our former discussion earlier on, you have to feel excited about this type of stuff. It's almost like a childlike playfulness that's a big part of this work. I'm not going to say it's like that for everybody, but that's a big part of how I approach it. And that's why through my own UPG and through my own gnosis and experimentation, I found that to work the best in terms of really freeing my mind from any sort of limitation. So what I'd like to say to your listeners is, it's not all about the spiritual. You can create a servitor to get yourself a good cup of joe every single day for the rest of your life. And yes, I have one of those. I do have a servitor which I created a couple of years ago because I was sick and tired of always drinking, excuse my French, shitty coffee. I was in a place at the time where that was pretty much the only thing I could get. So I created a servitor to literally get me, ensure that every single day I have at least 1 cup of amazing coffee. And it's an example I like to give to people at the end of my classes because it shows that we can use servitors for the big stuff. We can use it for the small stuff and everything else in between. It doesn't have to be all heavy and grand evocations. It can be literally to get you a couple of extra dollars at the end of the month or grow your business. You know, it's practical stuff like that.
Esotericist, magician, practitioner, and conjurer who has been stopping by to talk about servitors, sigils, and thought forms, Mademoiselle Vendredi. Mademoiselle, thank you so much just for taking the time and really sharing on these topics with the listeners today.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Listeners and patrons, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Mademoiselle Vendredi as much as I did. I really appreciated her reminders to never place limitations on what we think is possible with magical operations or rituals. Yes, personal ethics and priorities always play a role, and as Mademoiselle said, being able to own up to your decisions of whatever caliber is absolutely key, but allowing yourself to bathe in the sphere of the potential and bringing that into existence is just wonderful. So definitely check out the video and podcast descriptions below to learn more about Mademoiselle Vendredi's workshops. And also a huge thanks to each and every podcast supporter on patreon.com/glitchbottle. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You make this podcast possible, and you help it to continue to grow in new and interesting ways. And if you'd like to hop aboard the Glitch Bottle caravan with some extra exclusive perks, check out the links below as well. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.